Hey guys, it's Ms. Meglio here. Today we're starting our first video on our ecology unit and we're talking about ecosystems. Our key objectives of this presentation are to explain what makes up an ecosystem, to define different terminology used to describe ecosystem dynamics, to explain how energy and matter are cycled through an ecosystem, and to explain what types of factors affect an ecosystem. Alright, so the first thing we need to talk about is the term ecology. And basically what ecology is, it's the study of interactions of organisms and their environment. So scientists that study this are studying how these organisms are interacting with each other as well as where they live, their environment. Some other terms we need to know is an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is a community of organisms that interact with each other as well as their environment. So basically this is the same term as ecology, but it's not the study, it's the actual doing. So the community that's interacting with its environment and the organisms that live in that same environment. Another term we need to know is a habitat. It's part of an environment that an organism lives in and all of its available resources. So for example, let's say we had a rabbit and it lives in a forest, so all the bushes, the grass, the water, if there's bark that it's living in, all of that would be part of its habitat. So these are all terms we definitely need to know and we'll be using throughout the ecology unit. So make sure you get these down and take some time to actually learn these. So rather than just talking about the ecosystem as a whole, sometimes ecologists like to talk about specific parts of an ecosystem. So this is called an ecological hierarchy. You're talking about the specific parts. So an ecosystem comes into different levels. So the first thing would be an individual. That's the most simplistic part of an ecosystem. Then you have a population. After that, you have a community. And then finally, you have the ecosystem itself. And then even after that, you have a biosphere. So let's talk about these terms individually. So you have an individual, so that's one organism. You have a population, that's many of that same organism. Community, it's all the different types of organisms that are in their environment. And ecosystem's the entire thing, the environment, as well as all these different communities inside this environment. And then the biosphere is basically everything that makes up all the different ecosystems as well as the atmosphere. Basically the entire world is a biosphere. And we're going to talk about these terms in a little bit more detail because I just went over them a little fast. So let's look on the next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about each of those terms individually now. So an individual is one type of organism, a specific species of organism. So it's one species of organism, that one individual. So you, yourself, you are an individual. Our classroom, that would be a population. So it's a group of organisms in the same area that are the same species. So in our classroom, we're all humans and we're all in one area, so we would be considered a population. Next would be a community. So that's all the different species of organisms that are living in one area. So let's say we got a classroom pet and we got fish and cats. So we wouldn't be a population anymore because there's multiple species in the room. We would be a community. So a community is many different species living in one place. Next, we have an ecosystem. So we already learned about that, but that's all the organisms in one place plus the environment in which they live in. And finally, you have the biosphere. That's all parts of the earth, all the different types of ecosystems. The atmosphere, basically everything can be considered inside the biosphere. Our next few slides are going to talk about things that are commonly studied in an ecosystem. So the first thing that we'll be talking about is something called productivity. And what that word means is the rate of organic matter that's given off by producers in an ecosystem. So many times ecologists, people that study ecology and ecosystems, study this rate of the amount of organic matter that's available. So you should be thinking a lot of things here. There's a lot of words we've never defined before, such as organic matter and producers. Like, what is that? So let's first talk about those things so we can tackle this definition. So organic matter is something that's made up of hydrogen and carbon ions. And it makes up all living things. So when you think of organic, you usually think of something like organic vegetable. It's something really healthy for you. Organic basically is something, molecules that make up living things. And I have those asterisks there because they're made up of mostly almost all organic matter. 99.9% is made up of carbon. For the most part, carbon is that organic matter, and hydrogen ions, but not all of them. There's some exceptions, so I put the asterisk there. So inorganic would mean something that doesn't contain carbon and is non-living. So for example, this would be something like water. There's no carbon in it. But however, carbon dioxide is also considered inorganic because it has the carbon, but it doesn't have the hydrogen ions. So organic is something that makes up living things. It's usually made up of carbon and hydrogen. Inorganic, something that's not containing any carbon, and anything that's non-living. So productivity is basically the amount of biomass available. So the amount of that organic matter that's available for an ecosystem, for all those other organisms that live there. And the next thing we need to tackle in this definition is the producers. So what's a producer? And we've actually already learned about producers. So a producer is an organism that captures light energy from the sun and produces food. So with plants, we saw that they took in light energy from the sun and carbon dioxide, and they produced a food, which is glucose. So they're taking something that's inorganic and making it organic. So CO2 is an inorganic molecule, doesn't have those hydrogen, it's not making up the living things, and it's converting it into glucose, an organic molecule. So it had the 6 carbon, which is one of the things that makes up organic matter, the 12 hydrogen, another part, and the 6 oxygen. So making inorganic to organic molecules. And producers are also sometimes called autotrophs. So those terms are constantly used interchangeably, so I wanted you to know that. But producers are really, really, really important to an ecosystem because they're converting something that's inorganic to something organic. So it's basically supplying an ecosystem with this organic matter that they need to make them up. So you can't grow or anything like that if you don't have the organic matter that builds you. So all these organisms in an ecosystem rely on these producers to keep producing more organic matter and supplying this ecosystem with more and more organic matter. So producers are really, really important for the whole dynamic of an ecosystem. So now we're going to talk about food chains, and we already talked a little bit about this, so it should be familiar to you. But food chains are showing the energy and the flow of matter throughout an ecosystem. So energy, because some energy is always transferred and lost when organisms are consuming other organisms, and matter because you're consuming a organic molecule and then you're going to break it down. So matter is also flowing throughout an ecosystem. So basically, food chains are showing where this biomass is going. So where is all that carbon and organic molecules, where is it going in the ecosystem? So that's what really food chains are showing. So just an example of a food chain, we have the plants, the producers at the bottom that are producing the organic matter. Something, a primary consumer will eat that plant and that producer, and a secondary consumer can eat that primary producer, and so on and so forth, and constantly energy and matter is flowing and being transferred from one organism to the next. So basically, a consumer is something that relies on other organisms to obtain its energy. So it's not like a producer, it can't produce its own food, so it needs to eat other organisms to get that food source that it needs to break down into ATP like we saw for cellular respiration. and these organisms are also called heterotrophs. The last thing we'll talk about in this video is the things that impact an ecosystem. So there's different parts of an ecosystem. There's things called abiotic factors. So that's anything in an ecosystem that's non-living. So this is any of that inorganic matter. So water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, anything that's non-living is an abiotic factor. Biotic factors are anything that's living, so bio meaning life, so anything that's living. So basically this is all the organic matter, so the biomass in an ecosystem as well as the organisms in the ecosystem. And abiotic and biotic factors affect the survival and the growth of organisms in that ecosystem. So if there's no biotic things available, there's nothing for them to eat. And if there's not these abiotic factors, there's nothing for the producers to convert into organic matter. So both of them are incredibly important for the stability of an ecosystem. And organisms in an ecosystem compete for these resources. So they're constantly competing for food all the time. And that competition basically causes those adaptations for them to compete. So if they have different adaptations, so different characteristics that help them thrive in their environment, they'll be better to compete with other organisms for these resources. So that's basically why adaptations arise, is you're better adapted for your environment so that you can compete for these resources. And these adaptations in turn, that's what makes an ecosystem so diverse. So all of this competition, animals develop adaptations to compete for these resources, and that's what makes an ecosystem so diverse. There's so many different types of animals and all different types of organisms. And that's basically all because of this competition. So let's take a moment to summarize everything from this video because we talked about a lot. So ecosystems involve the interactions between organisms and their environment. So producers make an ecosystem viable by providing organic matter. Energy and matter can flow throughout an ecosystem. And abiotic and biotic factors affect how organisms interact with their environment. So I hope you guys learned something today and you took your notes on this. I'll see you guys in class. Bye guys.